The term of U.S. President George H.W. Bush marked an era of transition. Building on the foundation laid by Reagan, which established America's economic advantage over the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush showcased America's military dominance through a crushing victory over Iraq, then regarded as the world's fourth strongest military power. In the same year that the United States easily won the Gulf War, Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union, adding symbolic significance to this victory. The only country that could possibly challenge the United States had vanished, and from the White House's perspective, no other country could be considered a great power. America could finally impose its will upon any place on earth at its discretion, and the collapse of Saddam Hussein's powerful Iraqi regime was the best proof of this. A unipolar world order dominated by the United States had officially been born. However, just as Reagan's neoliberal economics brought prosperity to the U.S., while also sowing the seeds of deindustrialization, the victory in the Gulf War, which established the image of an invincible U.S. military, also gave the United States a military illusion. Military force, inherently a costly and difficult tool to wield, was now seen as something easily employed due to the ease with which the U.S. won on the Iraqi battlefield. From that point forward, the United States began to use, or threaten to use, war as a routine means of maintaining the existing order. This laid the groundwork for America's later military entanglements in Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, leading to multiple draining conflicts. If Reagan created America's sin of greed in the financial sector, then Bush created America's sin of arrogance in the military realm. The tragedy of America's fate lies in the fact that its greatest strength, the key to its past victories, gradually turned into its most fatal weakness. At the height of America's glory, the seeds of its decline were already being sown. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At this time, 21-year-old George H.W. Bush was a Navy pilot in training for a landing operation on the Japanese mainland. The use of atomic bombs spared the U.S. military from a brutal land invasion, and a month later, when Japan announced its surrender, the future president left active duty. During his time in the Navy, Bush flew a total of 58 combat missions, made 128 carrier landings, and logged over 1,200 flight hours. He was also the last U.S. president to have personally participated in combat during World War II. The Bush family is one of the prominent political dynasties in the U.S. Republican Party. At that time, it was almost a given that scions of such families would serve in the military before entering politics. After his discharge, young George H.W. Bush's life unfolded much like the depictions of the elite in movies. He enrolled at Yale University, became a member of the secretive Skull and Bones Society, graduated, and founded an oil development company before eventually running for Congress, setting him on the path to a political career. What made Bush unique was that as early as the 1960s, he had begun to develop close ties with America's intelligence community. In 1970, Bush was appointed U.S. ambassador to the United Nations by President Nixon, focusing on building influence in foreign affairs. With his family's powerful connections and his growing expertise in international relations, Bush, then 46 years old, had already become a significant figure in the Republican Party, and opportunities were never lacking. In 1973, when Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned due to a scandal, Nixon considered appointing Bush as vice president. The following year, Nixon himself was forced to resign due to the Watergate scandal, and President Ford again considered Bush for the vice presidency. However, Bush's close personal ties to Nixon raised concerns about possible secret deals, and Ford ultimately decided not to choose him. Instead, Bush was appointed as the head of the U.S. Liaison Office in China, effectively making him the U.S. ambassador to China. It was during this time in China that Bush became convinced of the need for the U.S. to strengthen its overseas intervention activities to maintain the global system. In January 1976, Bush returned to Washington, D.C., to become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency CIA. During his tenure, Bush oversaw Operation Condor, a secret operation coordinated by the CIA and various governments in South America to assassinate left-wing sympathizers and advocates of democracy, along with their families. Due to the fact that many of the documents related to Operation Condor have not yet been declassified, there is significant debate over the true scope of the damage caused. Conservative estimates suggest that across South America, 50,000 people were executed or assassinated, 30,000 disappeared, and 400,000 were imprisoned. The victims included dissident politicians, union members, peasant leaders, priests, nuns, and intellectuals. Bolivian President Juan Torres and Chilean Interior Minister Bernardo Leighton were among those killed by Condor operatives. CIA operatives also devised a horrifying method of execution known as death flights, where victims were sedated and then thrown from planes into the ocean to ensure their bodies could not be recovered. In 1977, an unusual storm hit Buenos Aires, Argentina, washing many bodies ashore and exposing some of Condor's crimes. But to George H.W. Bush, these victims were merely numbers on work reports. In 1980, the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan won the presidential election, and this time George H.W. Bush finally became vice president. He highly valued this opportunity and deliberately maintained a low profile in his work. Not only did he earn Reagan's trust, but he also had harmonious relationships with senior White House officials and cabinet members. This experience laid a solid foundation for his later bid for the presidency of the United States. With Reagan's support, Bush won the 1988 presidential election by a landslide, securing 426 electoral votes to Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis's 111. This was the last time in Republican history that the party won 3 consecutive presidential elections, and it was also the last time in U.S. history that a candidate won by such a wide margin. Since then, no U.S. presidential election has seen such a significant gap in results. However, due to Reagan's overwhelming popularity in the minds of the American people, Bush's entire presidency was overshadowed by him. In 1989, when George H.W. Bush entered the White House as president, a series of favorable events occurred within the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Boris Yeltsin managed to secure a seat in the Supreme Soviet and formed the first opposition party in the Soviet Union. In Poland, the Solidarity movement won an overwhelming victory in elections, leading to the collapse of the communist government. Hungary dismantled its border barriers with Austria, sparking a chain reaction. Soon after, the Berlin Wall fell, and the reunification of East and West Germany was put on the agenda. Although all of this happened during Bush's presidency, Americans generally attributed the credit to his predecessor, Ronald Reagan. To distinguish himself, Bush made adjustments to Reagan's policies in his first year in office. For example, Bush made addressing the rapidly growing federal budget deficit, a major issue left by Reagan, a top priority. However, one of the main promises of Reaganomics was to keep taxes low, and it was nearly impossible to reduce the deficit without raising taxes. As a result, Bush's domestic policy was harshly criticized by conservative Republicans who accused him of betraying Reaganism. Due to Reagan's immense influence, Bush, as his successor, found himself in a difficult position. Successes were attributed to the continuation of Reagan's policies, while failures were blamed on deviations from them. Thus, Bush began seeking breakthroughs in foreign policy, becoming more aggressive. He launched Operation Just Cause, the invasion of Panama, and later the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. The Gulf War victory became the defining achievement of the Bush administration and had profound consequences for the United States. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran became America's main adversary in the Middle East. The conflict between Iraq and Iran eventually escalated. And in order to weaken Iran, the U.S. provided Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq with weapons, intelligence, and technology related to chemical and biological warfare. With American support, Iraq's military power grew rapidly, making it the world's 4th largest military force and greatly inflating Saddam's ambitions. At the same time, Iraq had accumulated massive debts after 8 years of war with Iran, leading to economic decline and widespread domestic hardship. To relieve internal pressure, in August 1990, Saddam Hussein decided to invade and annex Kuwait. However, in order to maintain a stable supply of oil, the U.S. had promised to provide security for Arab nations. Saddam's aggressive actions directly threatened U.S. interests. In November 1990, under U.S. leadership, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution authorizing the use of force if Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. This was a carefully planned and skillfully executed military operation. On the diplomatic front, the U.S. had United Nations authorization. Meanwhile, the U.S. military had completed its transition to an information-based force, while Iraq's equipment was still at a World War II level. Geographically, 71% of Iraq's territory was desert, and the flat terrain greatly favored the U.S. military's advanced information systems. Politically, the U.S. received military or financial support from numerous countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Most remarkably, when many believed the U.S. would face a tough battle, the U.S. military won the war with surprising ease. After just 42 days of air strikes and 100 hours of ground operations, the U.S. achieved a swift victory with an extremely lopsided casualty ratio. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, only 148 American soldiers died in combat, 35 of whom were killed by friendly fire. In contrast, approximately 26,000 Iraqi military personnel were killed, and 75,000 were wounded. The US-led bombing campaign nearly sent Iraq back to the pre-industrial era. Advanced technologies developed after World War II, such as precision-guided munitions, global positioning systems, satellite communication systems, and airborne warning and control systems, demonstrated their overwhelming advantages on the battlefield. Economically, the US spent a total of $61 billion on the war, of which about $52 billion was covered by other countries. It could be said that the Gulf War was a successful display of US military might, funded by others. The US military finally overcame the painful shadow of the Vietnam War and regained its sense of global dominance. After the Gulf War, Bush's domestic approval rating soared to 89%. However, the seeds of future troubles were sown with this brilliant victory. It did not bring lasting glory for Bush. On February 2, 1991, the CIA established a radio station in Saudi Arabia called Voice of Free Iraq, broadcasting daily in Arabic to Iraq. The station claimed that the US military would soon liberate the Iraqi people from Saddam Hussein and incited the local population to rise against the Iraqi government. Since Shiites made up over 60% of Iraq's population, while Saddam's Sunni faction accounted for only about 30%, the US attack on Saddam's regime gave the Shiites hope of seizing political power. On March 1, 1991, an uprising broke out in Basra, Iraq's largest port city, against Saddam's regime. In a few days, the rebellion spread to all major cities in southern Iraq, where Shiites were the majority. In the north, the Kurdish minority also heeded the call from the US military and began fighting. However, despite having decisively defeated Saddam, the US military changed its approach. With the US's tacit approval, Saddam retained his regime and military, brutally suppressing the Shiite and Kurdish uprisings. A month later, Saddam's regime declared that all rebellions had been thoroughly crushed. Around 100,000 Iraqis died resisting, and millions of Kurds fled to Turkey and Iran. Bush's decision to allow Saddam to remain in power rather than occupying Baghdad and establishing a new government sparked much criticism within the US in a book co-authored in 1998. Bush explained that the US's primary goal was to maintain a balance of power in the Middle East. Occupying and rebuilding Iraq would have imposed unnecessary political and military costs on the US. Bush clearly adopted a realist approach, recognizing the limits of US power and the need to set finite objectives for war and foreign intervention, even if it meant compromising with adversaries America did not favor. Ironically, however, the Gulf War's overly easy victory led future US politicians to quickly abandon the principles of realism, believing instead that America had unlimited power to unilaterally reshape the world according to its will. The most notable example of this shift was Bush's son, George W. Bush. In 2003, George W. Bush completed what his father had left unfinished by overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime and attempting to reshape the Iraqi government using Western democratic systems. As a result, US forces were soon mired in a long and drawn-out insurgency, while Shiite militias in Iraq, supported by Iran, rose to prominence, becoming a crucial part of Iran's resistance network. The democratized Iraq not only failed to become a US ally but also became a significant source of trouble for the US on the other hand. US politicians failed to realize that the US military's success in the Gulf War was actually an exception. Faced with the mountains of Afghanistan or heavily fortified urban areas like Gaza, the advantages of precision, guided munitions and advanced information systems would be greatly diminished. The US military's technological edge was not as great as many had imagined. The quagmire of the Vietnam War was not far behind, and the embarrassing moments the US military experienced during the withdrawal from Kabul in Afghanistan echoed those seen during the fall of Saigon. In fact, it didn't take that long for President Bush to experience the consequences of victory's bittersweet defeat, although the Bush administration achieved diplomatic and military success in the Gulf War. American attention soon shifted to the struggling domestic economy. Bush failed to understand the core of Reagan's neoliberal economics, and in an attempt to address the budget deficit, he raised taxes, which contributed to the early 1990s US recession. Seizing on George H.W. Bush's weaknesses in governance, Democratic presidential candidate Bill Clinton adopted the classic campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid, ultimately." The young Clinton defeated Bush. Clinton also became the first US president in history from the baby boomer generation who had not experienced World War II. Clinton's presidency became known for two key reasons. First, economically, the Clinton administration oversaw the longest period of sustained growth in the post-war era. Second, morally, the Lewinsky scandal severely damaged his personal reputation. In a way, what happened to Clinton reflected broader changes in the US starting in the late 20th century, Rapid economic expansion coupled with a cultural shift toward more bizarre and unpredictable developments.